Hello there, and welcome to First Thursday Club. Today, we're going to be hearing about badges and development. I'm Tim Hounsome. I'm a director at RSK Biocensus. And I'm joined, just in time there, by our presenter today, who's Des Delahay. Before we get on with the presentation, we have a little bit of housekeeping to talk you through. As the presentation goes through, we will mute everybody's microphones. But you can ask questions through the question box, which you will find on your control panel, and I would encourage you to do so. At the end of the presentation, we will host the Q&A session then, so you can ask questions then, but also throughout the presentation. Once we finish today, shortly after the webinar, we'll send out a questionnaire, and it would be great if you could complete that and send it back so that we can refine what we're doing here with the First Thursday Club. Just before I hand over, I wanted to introduce you to our presenter today. I've known Des quite a long time. He's been involved in ecological research and consultancy for longer than he would probably care to admit. He currently wears a number of hats, and as long as I've known him, he always has done. He's a professor at the University of Exeter, a research scientist at the Animal and Plant Health Agency, and also a director of RSK Biocensus. Although Des's academic field is wildlife diseases more generally, badgers have dominated his research interests for much of his career, specifically research on epidemiology of badgers and bovine TB. Elements of this experience and research have also made it into our world of ecological consultancy. For example, the process of bait marking to help delineate badger territories was based on a paper co-authored by Des. In addition to this vast experience with badgers in research, Des has also been closely involved in numerous development projects over the years, where his in-depth knowledge of badgers and their ecology has been a huge advantage in allowing him to advise clients on coping with them on development sites. As I said, I've had the dubious privilege of working with Des for many years, and in fact, he was my long-suffering PhD supervisor. And as such, it pains me to say there is probably no one else in the country better qualified to give this First Thursday Club presentation on badgers. Over to you, Des.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. So let's have a look at what's in store today. I'm going to provide a whistle-stop tour of badgers and development sites as I see it. So we're going to start off with a little look at the ecology and behaviour of badgers. Then we'll talk a little bit about interactions with people. Then we'll discuss a few of the different survey techniques that we use to try to help us solve problems with badgers on sites, and finish off by talking about some of the techniques we use to actually manage them. So let's start with some ecology and behaviour of badgers. So the European badger is an instantly recognisable mammal with these black and white markings on its face. It can't be mistaken for any other British mammal. In this country, their weights tend to be around about 10.5 kilos for a male, something in the order of about 9 kilos for a female, but there's a lot of variation in that across their geographic range. They're specifically built for digging. Their whole physical shape reflects this. So they have a kind of bullet-shaped head, virtually no neck, and a very low-slung body with very, very powerful forelimbs and large, formidable claws on the forelimbs. This allows them to very efficiently excavate underground burrow systems, and their low-slung body allows them to flatten themselves and get under really quite small gaps. They have a very wide geographic distribution. So you can see from this map that in the west, they extend as far as Portugal and Ireland, and then all the way over to the Japanese islands in the east. They're present throughout the whole of Britain and Ireland. And if we distribution, we can see this map here shows some data from the National Set Survey carried out in 2013. Basically, the darker red those circles are, then the more badger sets there are in that area. And you can see that they're very widespread across the whole of England and Wales, concentrated in terms of density in the southwest of England and in the far west of Wales, with much lower numbers up in the north and in the east of England. So what gives rise to this this success in badgers managing to colonize such a large part of Europe and Asia? And well, it's in no small part down to their diet, their ability to be incredibly opportunistic about what foods they eat. They're what we call a highly adaptable omnivore, so they can home in on all sorts of different food sources as and when the need arises. But in the UK, generally speaking, they tend to specialize on earthworms in particular. And what they really like are these big, juicy, surface feeding worms that you can see in this picture here. This is Lumbricus terrestris. These worms can be found across the whole of the south of England and Wales in very large numbers across pasture. So they particularly like to surface feed on shortly cropped grasslands, and these make perfect foraging habitat for badgers. And badgers will move around these landscapes, hoovering up as many of these worms as possible. As soon as the weather changes, or at other times of the year when there aren't so many worms, a whole variety of other types of food. So a whole range of different invertebrates, fruits, including toxic fruits, what will be toxic to us, like yew berries. And yesterday I actually came across a badger latrine that was absolutely full of these stones from laurel berries. They also like crops, so maize in particular, they're very fond of, and they'll take a wide variety of vertebrates, so small mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. Diet will vary a lot according to the kind of habitat they're in and across their geographic range. And as I said, if the weather changes or at certain seasons, then they'll move away from their preferred food source of earthworms and concentrate on other sources. But this opportunistic habit that they have brings them into derived food sources. So in rural areas, you'll see that they'll take animal feed. You can see some badgers here taking feed from a hopper, and also one rather acrobatic badger climbing the side of a trough there to get at the food that's inside. Badgers will eat a whole variety of different things, often left out by homeowners. So all kinds of things I have seen in people's back gardens being fed to them. Loaves of white bread and roast chicken put out especially for them. Even one person who thought that they rather liked Mars bars, which no doubt they do, because they do have a bit of a sweet tooth. But chocolate is not ideal for them, because just like dogs, they can't metabolize theobromine in chocolate, and it can be toxic to them. But this familiarity with human-derived food sources, the internet attests to. This badger was habitually entering the kitchen through the cat flap, and had worked out how to open the fridge and help itself to all manner of goodies inside, until it was caught on camera. And the family who'd been blaming each other for things disappearing out the fridge at night found out who the real culprit was. So how do badgers organize themselves? Well, badgers are territorial and social animals. So they live in social groups that are very highly related to one another for the most part. And each of those social groups will hold a territory. Territoriality that they exhibit varies very widely. So when they're really packed into an area at high density, then they'll tend to be more territorial than when they're more spaced out at lower density. Group size also varies an awful lot. So it can vary from anything from just a couple of animals and perhaps a breeding pair with some cubs, right up to 20, 25 odd individuals in a social group. And a typical pattern is that each group will occupy a single large breeding set, which we call the main set. And then within their territory elsewhere, there'll be a variety of other sets, often of a smaller size and only used periodically. And handily for us as consultants, badgers tend to mark their territorial boundaries, and we'll get on to why that's useful a little later. So What do badgers from a single entrance hole to very large systems with 40 odd holes? But typically, badger sets entrances tend to be wider than they are tall. And you can see in this picture, it's like a capital D shape on its side. And they tend to have excavated inside to create the chambers, and the tunnels is pushed outside. And they can be very, very complex structures, especially the large ones. What we can see here is there's about 12 or 13 entrance holes, which are those shaded circles, and then a whole myriad of tunnels and chambers underground leading from those holes. Incredibly well engineered. Badgers are really excellent architects of their complex dwellings. So sometimes if you peer inside a badger set entrance hole, as I have done on many occasions, then you may see a sump which can gather water and prevent it from running down into the set. But also sometimes set entrances, the tunnel that extends from them turns sharply at almost 90 degrees from the entrance hole, and this is a way of avoiding air whistling into the wind whistling into the set. Or stone structure. There are many instances of badgers burrowing underneath structures like this this hole here that goes under a garage and has caused some subsidence. And they're not too features they burrow into. This is a picture of a cemetery in Bath where badgers have been digging into graves, essentially. So we'll talk a little more about their interactions with humans. Badgers and people, it's fair to say, I think, have had a rather checkered relationship. History of persecution of badgers through the rather demented so-called sport of baiting, where people would set dogs against badgers and would bet on the time it took for the dogs to pull a badger out of a hole or to kill a badger. That's those kind of pastimes. Badgers are also enormously popular with the public, so much so that there are a whole network of badger groups across the whole of the country underneath the umbrella of the Badger Trust. And the icon of the wildlife trusts, their emblem is a badger. 1992, the Protection of Badgers Act emerged, and the purpose of that act was to bring together a whole bunch of disparate legislation that related to cruelty to badgers and other animals. And what it does is it makes it illegal to kill, injure, possess, or ill-treat a badger. But very interestingly, and this sets it apart from a lot of other wildlife legislation, is that it prevents you from interfering with an occupied badger set. Now, thankfully, for the purposes of consultancy work, the Act does permit licensed interference where we need to, for example, move badgers out of a set. Another unfortunate way that we interact with badgers is through collisions with road traffic. And it's estimated that the number of badgers killed on our roads in recent years has been something in the order of 50,000 annually. I'm sure many of you will have heard about the bovine TB debate. This is a highly controversial issue. It excites a lot of public interest, a lot of interest and lobbying from farming organisations and so on. Badgers and cattle are involved in the circulation of the bacteria that causes bovine tuberculosis. But the big debate rages around what to do about that. And culling has been a main part of that, the policy for dealing with infection risks from badgers, and that has proved deeply, deeply controversial, and it excited the interest of lots of members of the public and some rather high-profile celebrities, including one former rock star who you may recognise in that photograph. So this might be a good moment to do a little bit of myth busting. So a popular headline in a lot of farming press: badger populations are exploding everywhere. There are too many of them, basically. Well, through work that we've done over recent years, we can certainly say that there have been increases in some areas, but not across the whole of England and Wales. In fact, Populations have probably increased in England since the 1980s by about 2% per year, but in Wales they've held more or less at the same level and not grown, it would appear. One of the reasons for the great success of the badger in the UK countryside is that where you create farming landscapes for cattle, so this sort of pastoral landscape with some arable mixed into it, then that tends to create a situation that's perfect for badgers. So where you farm cattle, you tend to farm badgers. That much is true. We know that the disease circulates between cattle and badgers. We know that cattle give TB to badgers as well as badgers giving TB to cattle. But the real question is what to do about that. And every time we look at what the main risk factors are, what we find is that the movement of cattle into herds is the single greatest risk factor for a herd experiencing a problem. So badgers are not all of the problem. About is that badgers are eating all the ground nesting birds and all of the hedgehogs. And it is certainly true that badgers will eat ground nesting bird eggs and they will take hedgehogs. But the causes of the decline of these species are far more complex and are not simply down to badgers. Badgers probably don't help the matter where badgers are present in high numbers, but the real drivers of the reduction in numbers of these animals are probably changes in land use, changes in agricultural practice and urban development. To look at some of the field surveys that we carry out, and we can tell you a little bit about what kind of signs we look for in the field. What do we look for? Badgers are very rarely seen. They're nocturnal and they're cryptic. But in this picture, basically the purpose of this picture is to show you that the profile of this woodland slope has been completely changed by the spoil heaps that have built up over time as a result of a badger set here. So sets can be very obvious. And paths tend to extend away from the sets and towards the territorial boundaries. Badgers are creatures of habit and they'll tend to use the same paths again and again. The best time to survey to look for sets is in the winter because for obvious reasons there's a lot less vegetation around and you can see sets more clearly. But if you want to see lots of signs of activity, then probably the best time is spring and then again in the autumn, because these correspond with when badgers are most active in terms of reproduction. So a little more about sets. Fine sets, well, they're usually under some kind of vegetative cover, so in hedgerows or in woodland and so on, but not exclusively. You do find sets out in the open, in the middle of fields. And of course, badgers do like structures, so you will find them around human structures. Now, as humans, we do like to pigeonhole things, and so there have been attempts to categorize different kinds of sets, and these are the most commonly used types of set that you will hear spoken about. The main set is the main focus of social behavior of the badgers in a particular group, and it's where the breeding, most of the breeding will take place. Then there are annex sets. These are smaller sets that are connected by a direct path to a main set. There are subsidiary sets, which are sets that are not connected by a direct path to the main set, but are elsewhere in the territory. And then there are outlier sets, which are, generally speaking, much smaller and only periodically used sets. Now, these different categories, they can have some value. I personally find that often, as far as consultancy work is concerned, we only really need to know the difference between main sets and other sets. What you do need to do, though, is you do need to survey a relatively wide area in order to understand what kinds of sets you're dealing with and to make judgments about where the main areas of badger activity are. And one sign of badger activity that we're very interested in of shallow pits in the ground, and badgers will deposit feces, urine, and everybody's favorite, anal gland secretions in these pits. And these you can find associated often with linear features, so you'll find them along hedgerows, the edge of roads, the edge of woodland, even along fence lines. but also sometimes with point features. So if you see a single mature tree in the middle of a field, then sometimes you'll find a badger latrine underneath that. The purpose of these latrines is that they convey lots of information. So they're basically full of lots of odors, lots of scents that the badgers have produced that communicate things about which group individuals belong to, their status, and perhaps their reproductive status too. And as you would expect, these latrines tend to be concentrated around the set, where there's lots of communication going on between group members, but also at the territorial boundaries, where animals from different social groups will be able to communicate effectively with one another through latrines. Now, we exploit badgers' habitual use of latrines to mark their territories using a technique called bait marking, mapping badger group territories. And importantly, what it does in consultancy terms is it identifies connections between sets, and that's a really critical piece of information that we need for trying to manage problems with badgers. It has a very interesting history. It was first brought to the UK by a biologist called Hans Krug, and he had been working in Tanzania, and he had carried out work on hyenas, and he was picking up a lot of hyena dung, and he noticed that in the hyena dung he would find glass beads, and these glass beads came from the necklaces of the Masai Mara people. And the Masai have a habit of, when people die, they dress them in all of their finery, including their best glass bead necklaces, and then they put them out in the bush for the hyenas to take. And so when Hans found these glass beads in hyena dung, he was able to speculate as to where the animals had been feeding. Now, these days, we necklaces in order to work out where badgers have been going. We use a bait consisting of peanuts, syrup, and an indigestible plastic marker. And if you use different colored plastic markers in different locations, then this can be useful for identifying latrines that are associated with different sets. So basically what you do is you feed your bait around the set that you're interested in. You put it in a shallow hole in the ground, shallow depression, and often put a rock on top of it to protect it from the elements. You do that for several days, and then you survey the entire area to look for latrines and dig through them to look for these plastic beads. It's not the most glamorous part of an ecologist's job. It has been published by some self-publicizing chap called Delahay. Out a map that looks something like this, although they usually don't. So this is a perfect bait marking map essentially. Coloured bait has been fed at the main sets where those stars are, and then it's been picked up at the various small square red marks there, which donate the location of latrines. And so you can build up a picture of social group territories using that approach. Another very useful technique that we use for activity is cameras. They're great for assessing activity at sets. They have little scent. They don't make any sound. And unlike junior ecologists, you can leave them out for several days without them complaining about overtime or food or water. And we use them in particular to assess what's going on at sets, as I mentioned, and to work out whether a set is in current use. And I'll come back to that term a little bit later. So we'll talk now about some of the management techniques that we use. What we're usually presented with as consultants is that a client has found what looks like a badger set on site, or our preliminary ecological appraisal has found a badger set on site. The thing to do then is to get advice immediately. Do not leave this potential issue to fester. And carry out a survey to collect as much contextual information as possible. The more information you can collect, then the greater your power of making a very informed will be. We then discuss with the client, establish the options. Can you work around the problem is probably the first question we would ask. Does your proposed layout really need to be like that, or can it be tweaked to accommodate the badger set? Do you really need to move these badgers around? Because moving badgers around is not a simple undertaking, and there are costs involved as well. So it's better for everybody all round if you can find a way to leave a set in situ. Whatever you're going to do, local authorities would need to understand how you plan to mitigate any impacts, but you won't get a license issued until you've actually got planning consent. Applications have to include a lot of contextual information and information about the work schedule. So the million-dollar question is, when do you need a license? Well, in the good old days, certainly then things were very prescriptive. So you had a whole bunch of different activities that if you were going to carry them out anywhere near a set, then you were going to need a license. But that all changed in 2009 when new guidance was issued. Although you do still see these guidelines about distances, you do still see them in the guidance that's issued by statutory nature conservation bodies, but also you often see consultants still using some of these prescriptive measures, even though there is little or no evidence behind them. So I think that prescriptive fixed distance rules were removed, not least because it created crazy situations where you might license light vehicles being within 20 meters of a set that was actually only 10 meters away from a dual carriageway, which seems absurd given that the badgers would be used to a certain level of disturbance. As Natural England were concerned, the new guidance aimed to better reflect intentions of the Act. So it was really about making judgments about whether you were likely to disturb a badger when it was occupying a set. And a set is defined in the guidance as any structure or place displaying signs indicating current use by a badger. And this term current use is interesting because it doesn't mean current occupation. Current use means that there are signs around the set that indicate that badgers have been using it sometime in the not too distant past. So if you've got footprints, hair, or signs of digging, then that set is in current use. And it's only when those signs have disappeared that the set no longer is in current use, and so it's no longer considered to be a set. Now, this is pretty difficult to work out in the field, especially for smaller sets that might be only used periodically. And so that's why I mentioned current use when we talked about cameras, because cameras can be very useful. Rather than trying to work out when all the signs have disappeared around one of these infrequently used sets, you can use a camera to demonstrate that, for example, over 21 days, you've had no activity at the set. It's therefore not a set anymore, and you can close it. But in practice, anything that risks damaging the structure of a set that is in current use will definitely be licensable. And in those kinds of situations, if you've got a set that's in the way of development, then you're going to be looking at a set exclusion and a license. But there are a few things that you should consider before carrying out a set exclusion. The first question is whether you need to close the whole of the set, or if you've got maybe a large set, whether you could get away with only closing part of it and leaving the rest. Also need to consider whether the set closure needs to be temporary or permanent. In some situations, it's possible to only temporarily close a set that you can reopen again to the badgers once the potentially damaging activity has been completed. But if you're going to close a set, then you need to, if you're going to close a set permanently, especially, then you need to provide alternative residence. So you need to establish that there is a naturally occurring set that the animals can use within the territory. Or if you can't demonstrate that, then you'll need to build a set. Chain link fencing pinned to the ground like this in order to convince the badgers that they need to leave and to prevent them from coming back in. And what is if you make it a very hostile environment. So if you're able to completely denude the set area of any vegetation make it completely bare, and then put your exclusion measures in place, your chain link and so on, then you'll create a really hostile environment, and hopefully the badgers will move away more easily. Prepare for the worst. Badgers can be extremely tenacious and persistent at trying to get back into a set, especially a main set. And this tendency to not want to move increases throughout the year. So if you're trying to exclude badgers in the autumn, for example, then they're going to be far more stubborn than they would earlier in the year. And what you'll need to do through that exclusion process is at some point you'll need to demonstrate that you've had 21 consecutive days of no activity of badgers at the exclusion site. And then you can assume that the set is empty, it's systematic destruction and proofing. But you need to be very careful when you destroy a set, even after 21 days. I do know of instances where even after 21 days of not seeing any signs at all, badgers were still found in the set. So essentially, your systematic destruction needs to be carried out very, very carefully. Now we'll talk a little bit about artificial sets. The first thing to say about artificial sets really is if you can avoid it, then don't build them, because badgers know far better how to build an appropriate set structure than we do. And so if there is any possibility of using a naturally occurring set instead of building an artificial set, then do that. There has been a tendency to just build artificial sets as a default approach to some problems, and I don't think that's a wise approach to take. Location is extremely important when you're thinking about artificial sets. They need to be in areas that are not prone to flooding. They need to be in areas that are not prone to very much higher levels of disturbance than the badgers would normally be used to. And they obviously need to be within the territory of the group and within a practical distance that you're likely to be able to encourage the animals to move from the target set into the artificial set. Artificial sets from, but there is no real standard guidance, which I think is a shame and something that we should seek to address in the future. But still, some of the best guidance comes from this very old publication from the 1980s by the RSPCA. So when you're considering an artificial set design, then you need to take into account what kind of size set you're closing down, and you need to replicate that sort of size. So you'll take a clue from the number of entrance holes of the set you're closing and the amount of spoil that's outside the entrance holes, which should give an indication of the extent of the chambers and tunnels beneath the ground. You also need to think about the architecture. So you'll need to try to imitate what natural sets look like. Well, that's pretty difficult because we don't have many very good examples of excavated mapped sets. That's something else that we need to perhaps address in the future. And very importantly, you need sufficient time. You need sufficient time to find the right location, to build the set, and importantly, to get the badgers used to using it and to gradually encourage them to start using it in preference to the set that you want to close. So now just a word or two about fencing. So you may hear about badger-proof fencing. You may see it. There are several different types that are advocated, but in my experience, many of them are actually just badger ladders rather than barriers to their movement. We tend to use fencing more often to try to encourage animals, try to funnel them in certain directions. But if an animal is sufficiently motivated, they'll get over all kinds of things. Badgers are actually incredible climbers. They're able to climb up some trees, over fences, and over structures. But if you're going to use fencing, example of some fencing and a one-way gate around a set that I encountered on a large linear infrastructure development project. And basically it exemplifies what you shouldn't do if you use fencing. So the first, use a fence like this, because this really is just a badger ladder. Any self-respecting badger that's got any kind of level of motivation will get over this quite easily. that this bare patch of ground here indicates where animals have been pushing under the fence. It hasn't been pegged to the ground, or rather hasn't even been dug in. And I mean, I would always suggest that fences are dug into the ground for some considerable depth in order to avoid badgers breaching them. But the best thing about this picture is this hole just beneath the one-way gate and fence, which rather negates the fence and the gate. So you can use electric fencing to try to keep badgers out of certain locations, but I think it's best used in moderation and only for relatively small areas. So what's the typical kind of process that you're faced with if you've got a badger set on a site that may need dealing with? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you would carry out a comprehensive survey, get as much information as possible to try and inform the decision-making process. You might need to carry out bait marking. You would possibly need to carry out an application for a license if you thought that there was any chance that you were going to damage the set or it needs closing down. You might need to build an artificial set to provide alternative residence for the animals. And if you were closing a set, you would need to carry out the process of exclusion and then destroy and proof the set. So timing is everything as far as these things are concerned. Your survey best undertaken in the winter, but can be done if you're going to do bait marking, then spring is the time you need to do it. Although possibly you can carry it out in autumn, although the results are usually not quite as good as in spring. If you're going to need a license application, then you'll have to write that, you'll have to submit it, and then the licensing authority will have to take some time to turn it around. And we live in rather uncertain times at the moment, so perhaps they won't always be able to commit to the 30-day turnaround. If you're building an artificial set, you need time to build it, and you need, I would say, at least 6 months while it's in place and you're encouraging the badgers from the set you want to close to go and take up residence in the artificial set. You then need to exclude the animals. That has to be done under license between July and November. Doing it as early in the season as possible. So can you imagine trying to get through all of that in a single season? That's going to be quite a tall order. And so it's really important that you start the process of trying to deal with badgers on a development site as early as possible. So I have 5 golden rules for dealing with badgers on development sites. My first is information is power. Get as much good contextual survey information as you possibly can, because this will allow you to make well-informed decisions and will be more likely to lead to successful outcomes. Ask yourself, is there another way? Can you build around the existing badger set? Is there a way to accommodate the badgers within the layout? That's always going to be easier and cheaper than going down the road of an exclusion. Never underestimate them. As I said, if they're sufficiently motivated, they will break back into all kinds of fortification. So make sure that you're doing things at the right time of year and make sure that you've really covered all the bases. Timing is everything, as we've just seen on that last slide. There's a lot of things to consider, and so you need to be thinking about things as early as possible. Get advice as early on as possible. Unfortunately, that can provide that kind of advice. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Des. That was fantastic. Thank you. And thanks everybody else for joining and watching that with us. We're now going to have a bit of time here for some Q&A. So I'll just kick off with that straight away, Des. There's a question here from Emmanuel. Badger sets can undermine railway embankments, requiring permanent exclusion under a licence and extensive remedial works to stabilise the embankment. Is there a sustainable way to prevent badgers digging through sensitive railway embankments that could be integrated into the design?
Well, there are lots of materials that can proof against badgers digging in. It's probably a question of cost, isn't it? And how large an area you need to cover will determine what kind of cost you're looking at. I mean, chain link, if it's suitably attached to the ground, is a great barrier. They're not going to get through that. But you can imagine a whole bunch of other different substrates that they're also going to find it difficult to dig into, you know, concrete, for example, or other stoneworks and brickworks and so on. So it's really a question of how big the area is that you want to cover and how much resource you've got to do it.
Okay, thank you. Another question here from Victoria, it's sort of related, I guess, because you could use the same scenario that Emmanuel just posed. The question is, if a badger set is considered to be a danger to the public, can it be destroyed without the normal process being followed?
So there's no hard and fast rules about this. You will get a fast track to getting a license if you are in what's considered to be an emergency situation where there's a health and safety issue. You will, however, need to talk direct to Natural England advisors about what you can and can't do in that circumstance. A huge amount of judgment needs to be exercised in those situations. They can be very tricky. But you know, if there is a danger to human life as a result of badger excavations, then clearly you're going to be able to get away with a lighter touch.
Okay. The one here from Jenny. She's asking for your thoughts on the use of cardboard tubes for artificial sets with the view that it's more sustainable. Get rid of the plastic, I guess.
I've actually not used cardboard tubes. I do think we need to look at the whole plastic issue, though. I think there's a lot of work to be done around this, around looking at more sustainable materials for badger set construction and how they stand up to the elements and you know, how they persist in the ground. So I have no experience of cardboard tubes, but I think it's definitely the direction to start looking in. I think this is ripe for a little bit of research.
Okay, there's one more here from Paul. This is probably a pretty unique situation, but I can think of some projects we've worked on where it might have happened. What happens when the whole territory is going to be lost to a development?
Yeah, well, that's a really tricky one. I think what you need to do is phone us up and pay us some fees to go and look at the problem. But seriously, I think I mean I have encountered these kind of situations where virtually all of the territory will be lost, and you're into situations where you're starting to consider moving badgers around and engineering territories, engineering the reconfiguration of territories, which can be very tricky. So there is no hard and fast rule. It really depends on the circumstances, on the context, on what information you've got on surrounding badger populations and so on. Yeah, as I say, get in touch and we can talk about it. But it's an extremely tricky one.
Okay, and this one actually I think is probably sort of linked as well. It's from Peter. He says, I often struggle in trying to understand the significance of the loss of foraging habitat on clan viability. Any advice?
Yes, it is tricky. There's not a huge amount of information out there. We know that grassland is very important to badgers, especially grassland that happens to be grazed. That usually has the highest abundance of available earthworms underneath it. We know that the proportion of that kind of habitat within badger territories is important in terms of the breeding potential of females in groups. That correlation has been established. So that's obviously a key habitat that needs to be protected as much as possible when you're considering which parts you can afford to dispense with in a badger territory. But it's not simple. It's not a simple matter because badgers will also switch to other foods that they'll find in woodland and so on. So you need to make sure that those kind of habitats are also available. I think it's an area where we need to develop better evidence.
Okay, thank you. There's one here from David. Do badgers also have underground latrines, as we have had bait marking surveys that have not delivered clear territory markers?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of reasons why your bait marking might not be terribly successful. There are definitely latrines underground, and badgers will use those latrines while they're in occupancy of a set. But of course, they serve a different function to latrines that you would find on territorial boundaries. So if you're not finding boundary latrines, I don't think the presence of underground latrines is going to be the reason. I think there will be other reasons. Maybe the survey is not comprehensive enough, or it was done at a difficult, challenging time of year, or it's possible that the badgers are far less territorial in that particular situation and are not marking quite as characteristically as they do in high density populations. Bait marking is it's a tricky thing to pull off, you know, to get enough good survey information to be able to inform a decision about territorial boundaries or the relationship between different sets.
Okay, interestingly, I've got two sort of devolved countries sort of questions here. One is that much of what you've covered today has been specific to England.
Yeah.
Are the processes in terms of licensing and legislation the same for Scotland?
The processes are very similar. You'll find some slightly different emphasis in the guidance from the different devolved organisations, but essentially that process for excluding badgers is more or less the same.
Okay, so another one that was linked here was from Robert saying, why have the badger numbers increased in England but not in Wales?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, reasons for badger population increase that have been put forward include changes in the kind of crops that we've been growing. A more increased reliance on maize has been one thing it's been speculated might have led to greater numbers in certain areas. The more sort of intensive use of pasture land, so which tends to create more good foraging habitat for badgers. That's another reason. As I said before, if you farm cattle, you farm badgers. Also, the level of protection that they get from local badger groups, from the activities of local badger groups, reduces persecution and so on, which might be a cause of declines in some areas, or preventing increases at least. But essentially, I don't really know the answer to that question, why Wales should have a different situation to England.
Okay, great. I think we're going to just take one more question, if that's right. This is from Rebecca. Is there much evidence as to how well artificial sets are occupied? Are they effective and used long term?
So that is a very, very good question. Again, the evidence base is really poor. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, has attempted to collate the collective experience of all the consultants who've done these kind of who've built artificial sets, but it would also require that they were monitored, and most artificial sets aren't really monitored. You know, we don't tend to build into the whole process a period of monitoring that's the success of the outcome. And I think you could say that about an awful lot of mitigation work that we do for other species as well. We often don't know what works simply because insufficient monitoring has been carried out. So I would like to see a lot more discussion about best practice in terms of building artificial sets. I would like to see best practice issued and widely available, and I would like to see some consultants getting together and trying to monitor the uptake of artificial sets, so that we can start to collate their experiences and get a better idea of what works and what doesn't.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll probably leave it there for today, but thanks very much, Des. I'm going to finish now by saying thank you to everybody for attending, and thank you, Des, again for your presentation. As I said at the start, we'll be sending out a questionnaire shortly via email for any feedback, which I would be grateful if you could complete and send back. And the last thing to say here is that we've got another First Thursday Club coming up on the 1st of October, and it will be Pete Walker, and he'll be talking about fish, almost certainly, because that's all he ever talks about. And I think the title of his presentation is going to be called something along the lines of Where There's a Weir, There's a Way, probably to do with eel ladders and that sort of thing. So just to finally say, if you've got any other questions, please just email us on one of those two emails you can see on the screen there, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you again on the 1st of October. Thank you.